Community Management, Strata Adviser with Hynes Legal. With me, as always, Frank Higginson, partner, Hynes Legal. Frank, welcome.
Hello, everyone. Again.
Again, thank you for joining us on what is hopefully a dry Thursday in your part of the world after a very, very wet last week. If you're still on holidays, good on you. We are not at all envious, even the slightest. And if you are border restricted or in any way inconvenienced, hopefully it's not too much longer before things resolve themselves in that regard. This week, we're on to our second April webinar, 5 webinars in April, our second of the 5th, one that's got a bit of interest, challenging person facilitation. It's all a bit woke, isn't it, Frank? Challenging person?
It's probably new age language. They would have previously been referred as nuisance owners, and I think we've got a reason why we're not doing that.
Frank.
Or worse, yeah, I suppose, yes. Various names under the sun. And I think probably this is an interesting one in the context of when Chris and I were sitting down to talk about what the opportunities might be in terms of him leaving his role as commissioner and coming across to joining us. This wasn't something that was probably up the list in terms of things, but has turned out to be probably one of the main things that's keeping you busy, amongst others. But in terms of if you've got a basket of work, this would be a substantial portion of it. So the opportunity today is probably to explain to people what it's really all about.
I think so, Frank. And you're absolutely right. Day in, day out, we get inquiries which centre around the idea that there is somebody involved in a body corporate, and it's not just an owner, by the way. Oftentimes it is, but it's not just an owner. It can be a tenant, it can be a member of a committee, it can be a caretaker, it can be a body corporate manager, it can be somebody associated with all of those people who is making life for the body corporate in some way difficult. I'm going to talk a little bit about what that is, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what it is that we are actually doing in that space. Just a couple of things. Don't forget to like and share. Make sure you subscribe and sign up to get reminders for these webinars. That's how you get a reminder to attend. You also get a little bit of content afterward. And if you've got queries, just chuck it in the chat function on YouTube today, and we'll try and get to those as best we can. As Frank was just alluding to, we started calling this challenging person facilitation after, in fact, I got called on it by someone. I was using the term nuisance, as I think most people would tend to do, because that's how the legislation tends to call it, nuisance. And then somebody, I think quite rightly in hindsight, Frank, called me out for it and said, well, as soon as you start calling somebody a nuisance, then you've labelled them, and that's absolutely the wrong place to start. Because if your aim is to improve things, ultimately, if the journey is to improve things, then if you start out by labelling them, it's the wrong place to be, isn't it?
Yeah, calling people names. You know, I've got a client said to me years ago, you know, we learn most of life's important lessons in kindergarten, you know, share your toys, play nice with the other kids, don't call the other kids names. And if you applied a lot of that to Strata, it might save some of these difficulties. But absolutely, it's the sort of the nuisance, and Section 167 of the Act refers to nuisance.
Yep.
But it doesn't help. And I suppose this is the difference between, I suppose, the legal stuff that the lawyers do, black letter law and all that sort of stuff, and what you'd call, I suppose, the non-legal stuff that Chris is doing, in the sense of we're not instantaneously going DEFCON 1, here we go, you're a nuisance, bang, bang, bang. There's a background to these things that usually can work itself out. And even, as we found so often, the thing that people are particularly fidgety about at a particular point in time when they engage us isn't usually what the problem actually is.
That's right, Frank.
It goes way back when.
That's right. We're going to have a few learnings for everybody today, or lessons, if you want to call it that. The first lesson, or the first learning, avoid labels because they colour things. And the second one, we already talked about this, don't assume it is just simply one type of person that is causing problems. There's actually a few different variations that there could be. All right, so what do we define as a challenging person? Let's get into it. So look, at its most basic, a challenging person is someone who's causing another party, be that the body corporate or another party, a considerable basis of time, energy, money, and angst. And that's pretty much the basis on which people come to us, isn't it, Frank?
It is. And to me, I think the best example is when you get that email and your stomach goes into a knot. That's the sign that something's going wrong, because for whatever reason. And I suppose one of the things for me is people always, why are they doing this? Well, and sometimes there's no way to explain it. Some people are just awful.
Yep.
That's the reality of it. Some people have a genuine grievance. Some people have been left in the dark and feel they've been fibbed to. Some people have made a poor business decision, maybe to invest in a unit or otherwise. But there's a whole bunch of driving factors. But I suppose at the core of it, it's they manifest themselves in behaviour that you wouldn't call normal, and maybe a bit obsessive.
And then it causes issues elsewhere. So you've got the behaviour, which then causes outcomes, and those outcomes are the time, the energy, the resources, and the angst that goes into it. It can be, so a challenging person can be somebody who is abusive, intimidating, harassing, who communicates quite destructively or quite negatively. But interestingly enough, it's not simply those things, is it, Frank? We've encountered a couple of times a challenging person who's actually quite polite, quite reasonable in how they come across, but it's actually their actions, their demands, which are causing the problem.
Yep, absolutely. And usually it's accompanied by some form of legal threat. Those get thrown around everywhere, be it defamation, be it applications to the Commissioner's office, whatever, threaten to sue you, all that sort of stuff tends to tag along with it. And it is sort of that, one of the other things that these sort of people we're talking about today create is a sort of defensive posture in the people they're attacking. Instantaneously, you sort of want to put up the barriers and not necessarily do what it is that they're asking you to do. And part of our job, I suppose, this will get the facilitation bit, is helping people understand what they should be doing in relation to these things, both legally and commercially.
In a body corporate context, a challenging person is someone who either doesn't vote or who always votes no, or somebody who puts up obstacles to things getting done in a body corporate context. So remember, I say this all the time, being in the body corporate is about making group decisions. So a challenging person can be somebody who makes that process difficult, if not impossible. Frank's hit upon a really good point there, where a lot of legal threats that are often baseless are made. Somebody who creates or contributes to disharmony some way, and there are various ways that manifests itself. That's a really good kind of base point, I think. Yep. Some of the challenging behaviour we deal with, Frank, a lot is behaviour that doesn't necessarily manifest itself seriously enough to go to the police or to take legal action about. So and we'll talk about that in a minute, but it's action that you can't necessarily deal with through other means, isn't it?
Yeah, it sort of bubbles along and it's constant, you know? And I think even when you get to, there's an article in the Sunday Mail or the Courier Mail, I think a week or two ago, talking about the 27 people that have been declared vexatious litigants in the Queensland court system. Trish, is there the opportunity to declare someone a vexatious litigant in the Commissioner's office?
There is not, no. So there is no such thing as a vexatious litigant for the purposes of the Commissioner's office. Should there be? I think there probably should be. There's got to be some consequences for taking up time, money, and resources. And remember, this is public taxpayer money, time, and resources. But anyway, that's probably a topic for another day. But good point nonetheless, Frank. Sometimes got to remember, challenging behaviour or a challenging person gets that way because of a medical condition or a high stress situation. And importantly, they get that way because of a genuine grievance, a genuine complaint that has not been properly dealt with. That's a really important point to make. So somebody can be a challenging person, but how they've gotten there is through not really much fault of their own, I suppose, is what I'm saying there. So that's various ways in which somebody might be challenging. In the body corporate context, a challenging person is often somebody who sends in a really high volume of emails, demands, requests, queries, demands to get work done. A very common one is somebody who sends email after email after email to a chairperson or a body corporate manager saying something needs to be attended to or something needs to be done. That's a very common one, isn't it, Frank?
Absolutely. And that's that obsessive bit to a degree, where they just won't seemingly let go.
Yep.
Let's keep grinding it out. And that can be multiple times a day.
Yep.
You know, it's sort of probably the worst one would have been 5 or 6 times in relation to one day, the same issue. Have you dealt with it yet? Have you dealt with it yet? Have you dealt with it yet?
I've seen some that were more than 5 or 6, Frank. Yeah. But that's a really good example for the body corporate context. And so while we're talking about body corporate context, can't we just deal with this under body corporate legislation, Frank?
No. Well, I suppose in theory you can. You're back to what is a nuisance owner under 167. You've probably, if you've got the right bylaw, you might be able to do something in relation to a bylaw breach. But the difficulty with all of these things is they take time. You know, you were on record, I don't know, a month or two ago now about how the Commissioner's office is under-resourced proportionally. Same number of people or less from really 6 or 7 years ago when you started to today, and the exponential growth of strata schemes continues to grow. So as best as we can tell anecdotally is that there's a lot going on in there. So the time frames for responding to applications, conciliations or otherwise is going out. That's not to criticise them because they've only got limited resources to do what they've got to do. And none of these disputes or issues are simple. So reality is if you go in there looking for an adjudication, you're probably waiting, I'd say somewhere between sort of 5 and 8 months at the moment to get an outcome, which isn't necessarily good for anyone because people live with these issues. That's the problem.
No, you're absolutely right, Frank. And look, sometimes a bylaw breach or a nuisance proceeding might be absolutely necessary in some circumstances. And don't forget, the work that I do is not a legal proceeding. So there's no reason why the two things cannot be considered in tandem or one can follow the other. So you don't use up all of your weapons straight away. So which leads us, I suppose, to our third learning or our third lesson from today's webinar. Not everything that happens in a body corporate is a body corporate responsibility to resolve. So just because somebody is a challenging person and they happen to live in a body corporate does not mean that we have to rely upon body corporate legislation to deal with that. While we're on the topic, can't we just take out an AVO or a peace and good behaviour order or sue for defamation? Or can't we just do that, Frank?
No. So definitely, and I don't know, I talk people off defamation ledgers probably once a week, particularly the day they've got whatever it is that they've actually got that's upset them. It's sort of cool. Yeah, good news is you've got 12 months to do something about it. So let's park it for a week, see what the feedback is and go from there. Because unlike, I suppose what you get in the States, we don't have a mechanism here where there's a whole bunch of aggravated damages for nasty things being said, particularly in a body corporate context. It's very rare for something to be of that nature. You might go to the Jeffrey Rush type stuff and that sort of thing where things published in national broadsheets, then there's some more consequences from that. AVOs and DVOs, DVOs, domestic violence order, so you've got to be in a domestic relationship, so that cuts that out. And AVOs, again, I've been asked this a bit, refer these to our criminal lawyer friends that because we don't do this sort of work, but you actually need apprehended violence order. It means there needs to be some threat of violence. It's not annoyance. So the sort of ongoing behaviour that is annoying, obsessive, and just off the tree, for want of a better phrase, isn't necessarily that.
That's right. That's right. So, before we get on to what challenging person facilitation through Hynes actually is, I just want to acknowledge a couple of questions there from John and Ricky. Thanks very much for watching, both of you. We will get to those questions in a few minutes' time. Some good questions there. But, okay, challenging person facilitation. So this is the actual product or the offering that we have, which we reckon can actually help in a number of situations. As Frank said before, it may not work in every situation, but the first benefit is that it actually gets you further along the path than where you were. You actually have to start somewhere in the process to start dealing with the problem. And I guess, Frank, it's an approach based not on the law so much, although it's definitely within lawful guidelines. It's an approach based upon communication skills, interpersonal skills, but for me in particular, because I'm the person who's doing this, it's based around my mediation skills, qualification and training. And look, mediation training, mediation skills Everyone has an idea about what that means, but I can assure you it is a very rigid, very much a set framework, set of skills and processes which are designed to bring people along a process and make them feel like they've been part of a process, a positive, meaningful process. And those are the skills I utilise. More than anything, Frank, when we start off with challenging person facilitation, it's a circuit breaker, isn't it?
It is. I mean, and part of it for me is helping people see the forest and not the trees. Because the reality is that most, well, every client we've had who's appeared with needing this sort of product has been belted from pillar to post, usually for months, if not years. And one of the difficulties we've got is clients who've had that for a really long time. They've almost got a version of PTSD where and it's usually a body corporate committee.
It's not a version, Frank. It's a real thing.
Yeah. They're there and they just can't see their way clear. They're frightened of doing anything that might trigger the person doing something else in relation to the committee doing actually what they've been voted in to do.
Or even worse, Frank, it might trigger a second person. I think that's a very big fear in a lot of buildings, that we've got one challenging person, but if I make a decision or if I do anything, doesn't matter if it's based upon the best possible consideration, if I do something, I might actually get a second one. One was bad enough. Yeah.
And this is the whole thing. If nothing changes, nothing changes. If you want the same outcome, keep doing the same thing.
Yep.
That's the brutal reality of it, you know. So legal processes that might get you somewhere. This is stop. Let's step back from it all. Let's help you understand what the issues are, where you could be going, what you should and could and might want to do, and just get hold of the situation as a whole. Because really, and you know, I think one of the oldest legal maxims is the lawyer who acts for himself has a fool for a client. And that I can tell you absolutely, like whenever we've got an issue that comes up, we actually go and get, particularly on HR type stuff, we'll go get independent legal advice. Not going to be our own lawyer. We don't know it. We don't understand it. And we're clearly too close to it. And I think that ability to sort of step back and divorce yourself from the situation when it becomes really toxic is really, really hard to do. So the first step is engaging you to do that.
It's a form of intervention, Frank. It very much is. It's okay, I can't deal with this any longer. Somebody else needs to step in and help us, which I guess is the fourth lesson or the fourth learning today. It's about the fact that challenging person facilitation is helping you remember what the issues are, because if things have gone on for a period of time, you've forgotten. It's been lost in the sands of time where this started and what the actual issue is. So you've got person A being challenging, and that's all you are focused on because it's been that way for 12, 18 months, 2 years. But where did it come from? Where did it start from? If we think about that, then we can potentially work back to the source of the issue. So that's learning 4. Get in there, try and trace it back to what actually happens. And so how does it all begin, or how does it work? It begins with me having a conference with whoever it is involved. Most of the time it's a committee, not all of the time, I've got to tell you, but most of the time. And it's a conference where I try and extract the issues, the priorities, and I do that using a range of techniques to try and get people thinking a particular way, focused on a particular set of prompts and a particular sets of topics. Once we have the conference and we've been able to establish a few priorities and a few boundaries, the next step is that I am retained, usually over a period of months, to work with the client about trying to positively influence the relationship with that challenging person. And the way in which I do that is by being involved in the communications that come from that challenging person. So at its most basic, what happens is that, let's just use the example, Frank, the committee is our client in that case. Committee's got a challenging tenant, let's just say, for argument's sake. The communication from that tenant comes to me. I analyse it. If necessary, I'll seek advice from one of the legal team here at Hynes, and then I will go back to the committee and say, based upon what's been presented to me, here's how I think you should reply, or indeed, here's how I think you shouldn't reply at all. Here's why that's the case. Here is my suggested response back. The point of all of that is that over a period of time, rather than directly confronting the person and saying, you're being challenging, stop it, we're actually demonstrating through actions. We're going to try and change the dialogue. We're going to try and change the narrative. That's by changing the tone. It's by changing the words. It's by changing the frequency. It's also by changing the number of words that you use as well. Instead of using a 500-word response, let's keep it to 50. Let's try that for something different. So that usually that happens over a period of months. It sends a message to the challenging person. Frank, it basically draws a line in the sand, doesn't it, without saying that.
Yep, and these things escalate. So what happens a lot is the reply all, the late night emails, all of that stuff that you get an email, you respond to it and all that sort of thing, that goes away. To me, that's the start of the de-escalation of these things. So I think as Chris points out, you don't have to respond to every email. And in a sense, there's a communication protocol that you should put in place that starts to allow people to deal with these things. And I think one of the other joys we've had is strata managers who previously borne the burden of this are suddenly able, not necessarily to offshore their job, but they're laying this problem at your feet. And the intent really is to do ourselves out of a job over time, because once the committee and the strata manager understand how to respond and what they need to respond to in the manner of the response, firstly, the circuit breaker being the time slowing down, get you a bit there. You get educated along the way about dealing with this person and their particular issues. And ideally, in the not too distant future, it's like, okay, we don't need you guys anymore. We're right. But it just helps get out of that that urgency, because it really is that reply all, emails firing across to each other's desk at 9 o'clock at night. It just becomes all bad for everyone.
In some cases, I might be engaged to speak directly with the challenging person. I've got to say that is the absolute exception, and that's probably an extreme tactic, which is our fifth learning or our fifth lesson of the day. Direct confrontation rarely gets the kind of result that you want in this situation. So it's always better to hang on to that as a reserve power, which leads us to our sixth learning of the day. And I think, Frank, you've already alluded to this. You try other options before you press the red button. You try some other things.
Absolutely, because you never lose the right to go legal. You know, I say that having said defamation proceedings, you get 12 months, you do. But there's time limits for some things. But if someone's breaching bylaws, you can belt them today, you can belt them tomorrow, you can belt them next month. You don't need to do it straight up. And quite often, we see this a lot again, and this is previously the lawyer blinkers I've had on. Here's the only option for dealing with someone breaching bylaws. There are other ways to do it, which is what really Chris joining Hynes, 18 months ago, whatever it is now. So it's really that slow down, that look at it, and it really is step back and to a degree get a bit of strategy. So we have a problem. We know we've got a problem. What can we do to solve that problem? So here's the intervention, facilitation. Let's understand all of the moving parts, understand how you might want to respond to these things. Know that if that doesn't work, then we absolutely can go to this as a plan B. But, and mate, I will say, I think we're getting pretty good outcomes on the facilitation pieces where we are doing ourselves out of work, because these things die down when they're handled the right way. They really do. And some people, you're never going to solve some people. So for those, that's then a matter of educating the committee around, okay, here's how you need to deal with these issues. This is going to come up all the time, and one of the difficulties we have with committees, as unfortunate as it might be, is owners in a sense can be as unreasonable as they like. Committees have a statutory obligation to act reasonably. So there's a degree of transparency and accountability that they've got to continue to have. So we're not, sometimes saying to committees is they can ask for that and they're entitled to it. And that's the brutal reality. So give it to them, because if that goes to adjudication, you're going to look really bad.
And it's going to cost a lot of money, and it's going to keep adding to the difficulties. It's a good moment to segue into the questions. Ricky, thanks for tuning in. What are the validities of committees passing communication guidelines until such time as they can create a bylaw? No validity to that whatsoever. Ricky?
It's like a house rule.
Yep, zip. Zip. So it's basically, if I'm reading that correctly, it's basically the committee adopting a mantra or a policy about communication. No, legally would mean nothing under those circumstances.
And to me, it's back to what's acting reasonably. So I think, to me, having the right bylaw, which leads to, I suppose, the other question there from the Mays, is that there's staying anonymous, which is cool, is that there's the ability to have a crack at someone for nuisance. So we're talking legal again here, the ability to have a crack at for someone being a nuisance under 167 of the Act. But if you've got a bylaw that really creates obligations around reasonable behaviour and communication and engagement, all those sort of things, then it's a separate process, might be a bylaw enforcement process under the CMS itself. So that's the type of bylaw that you would have. So Ricky, I suppose if you don't have that bylaw, it comes back to you're acting reasonably. Whether those guidelines are reasonable or not is something else entirely. And I suppose that's ultimately where adjudicators are always going to get involved. Because even when you get there, I wouldn't suggest that you've got in your bylaws a specific set of guidelines. What you should have is something that's a proper, I suppose, behavioural bylaw, for want of a better phrase, and then the interpretation that goes into that depends on the individual circumstances. Because one of the examples Chris always uses is you might have someone that fires in a whinge with 20 particular items. 19 of them might be complete rubbish, but one of them might be something you need to respond to.
Yep.
So, for example, if your bylaw says if you fire in something that's more than 2 pages, we don't have to respond to it, then that's not going to cut it.
Yep, definitely. Which I think the Mays, I think we've just answered your query as well, and note your point about the nickname. So yeah, but I would just caution against rushing towards the bylaw situation to deal with a challenging person. Yes, in some cases that's necessary. I would suggest that in the majority of cases, the approach that I'm promoting is probably your better answer. In the very short time that we've got left, I just want to cover off a few more details. It's a process that I do over a period of time. So over a period of time, it's meant to try and influence a better outcome. So we do have a couple of cases, and I won't go into them in any detail now, but we did actually see in one situation where I worked with a committee with a challenging person, we did actually start to see some very, very small green shoots of improved interaction from the challenging person after we had put this process into place for a period of time. So we can say that with patience and a willingness to accept that these sorts of things can take a little bit of time to get positive outcomes, you can achieve it if you're willing to work at it. In terms of cost, let's have a chat about that. It varies from case to case. What I can tell you, I reckon it's cheaper and quicker than bylaw enforcement to BCCM. I think, Frank, you would agree with that as well.
Yep.
And if you haven't been able to move forward over a period of time, it's probably worth it anyway to at least start you moving in the right direction to get a positive change in the situation. Do you reckon I've missed anything there, Frank?
Not really. I mean, a party, maybe sometimes I keep talking about doing this, but I need to go buy a magic wand. Sometimes there is no magic wand. We can't wave it and make everything great again, because some of these things have, the people might be the issue, the history might be the issue, the entrenched positions might be the issue. But the reality is that's where you are. Right, wrong, or indifferent, that's where you are. So it's okay. How are we now going to do that? And that's I think the thing for me is that unless you actually decide to do something, nothing is going to change. So, and part of it is, why not lock in the former commissioner who, haven't said this one for a while, Chris, but no one rang the commissioner's office when Chris was commissioner to say, geez, I'm glad I bought that unit. You guys are doing a great job. All it is was year in, year out of people complaining about body corporate issues in 1,000 different forms. So there's not going to be much that Chris hasn't seen and had detailed discussions with adjudicators about issues across all of the cases, across all of the personal behaviour, across all of the seminars. So in terms of actually getting a solution that can turn out quicker, absolutely more cost effectively, and actually just get you a better outcome. I think you'd say a managed solution is much better than an enforced one.
Oh yeah, absolutely, Frank. Yep.
You know, if people buy in and gradually get there, and we manage expectations on behaviour, probably a little bit on both sides sometimes, then that is going to lead to an outcome that is going to be workable. As you say, mate, it might not be, we're not singing Kumbaya and going to Christmas parties together, but we've got a relationship inside this body corporate that we can now manage. You can finish up with that. That is much better than any legal proceeding.
That's exactly right. And on top of that, it's the use of a standardised set of communication mediation techniques used Australia-wide, benchmarked to within an inch of their life. These are tried and true methods of bringing people together in a process that encourages more appropriate communication, or at least getting people to a better spot than when they started. John, the maze, your final point there about, so if it can't be addressed with a difficult person, what does the committee do? Give up? What can we do at law? I reckon, Frank, that's a part 2. So you've tried, so maybe we try a part 2 in which we just tease a bit more out of this process. It's, okay, what do we do after that?
We can't talk to them. They're completely crazy. What do we do?
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yep.
That's a webinar in its own right, John.
Absolutely. Absolutely, it is. As always, gosh, time has absolutely flown today, as we thought it would with this particular topic. Look, there's a lot of info and a lot of content here to unpack, particularly for people who are watching this afterwards. I think the best thing that we can say here is, if you think you've got a scenario that might suit this kind of work, drop me a line, give me a call, we'll have a chat about it, and then we will set it all up to potentially go after that. Final question there from Mr. SMB. Is there a spirit of BCCMA or a spirit of the law? Is there a vibe? Kind of. It's about, yes, I think there is. It's about promoting harmonious schemes.
Self-governance.
Self-governance, which is effectively what I am trying to do. So yes, there is. One point, we had a query given to us beforehand today about what can we do about challenging people who prompt a huge volume of adjudication applications to my former office. Thank you to anonymous submitter who gave us that question beforehand. I reckon we might cover that in part 2, because there's actually a few aspects of that we can cover off in that aspect. Sandra, your question, thank you. When will that webinar be? We might try next month, Frank.
May's a good one. We're talking about the webinar topics beforehand, so we've got to do part 2 of getting off committees, which is the first one in May. We might do the part 2 of this one. Okay, facilitation or intervention didn't work. What can you do? And
to also cover off on the points we didn't get to today. Yep. As I say, got queries, drop us a line, get in touch. No harm in doing that.
Ask the question.
Yes, do the research, Frank. Ask the question, do the research. Don't forget to like and share. Make sure you subscribe so that you know what we're doing and when. It's always useful. Sometimes we don't know. But for now, thanks everyone for tuning in. Frank, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for everyone for joining us again.
Yeah, really appreciate it. We'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye-bye.